have control over all of the apparatus of state. It is maybe, if you like, semi-renegade. But it strikes me that overriding all of these debates about whether Serbia is a failed state or a rogue state in 1914 is the basic line that actually, even if you decide that Serbia was a rogue state and the Austrians were within certain limits, within their rights to go in and sort them out, you do not do so when you are posing a direct threat to a major great power rival. And I think the rogue state analogy breaks down, because if you think of what the United States and coalition did to Iraq in 2003, that was not in the face of Iraq having a great power sponsor who was going to react. It's a completely different situation. Well, the Austrians would not have had the nerve to go forward with this plan had it not been for getting top cover from their senior partners in Berlin. On the 5th of July 1914, Wilhelm II, after consultation with his senior officials, issued what's become known to history as the blank cheque. In other words, a guarantee of unconditional support to Austria-Hungary. The evidence is pretty clear that the Austrians and the Germans knew the risks involved, that this might spiral out of being a local Balkan conflict into something much bigger, much nastier. An official of the Austrian Foreign Ministry wrote in a private letter on the 8th of July that Count Berchtold, the Austrian Foreign Minister, was determined to use the horrible deed of Sarajevo for a military clearing up of our impossible relationship with Serbia. With Berlin, we are in complete agreement. Kaiser and Reichschancellor, etc., more decided than ever before, they take on board complete cover against Russia, even at the risk of a world war which is not ruled out. That does not strike me as being two governments who are somehow sleepwalking into a conflict. The crisis is slow burning at first, not least because the Hungarians, part of the complicated constitutional settlement of 1867, the Hungarians have a very great deal of autonomy within the Habsburg Empire. They have to be brought on board. Eventually they were. On the 23rd of July 1914, the Austro-Hungarians deliver their draconian ultimatum to the Serbian government, the terms of which were so severe that the Russian Foreign Minister Sasonov's reaction on hearing them was, "It's the European war." These are terms that are clearly intended to be rejected by the Serbs. Much to the annoyance of the Austrians, the Serbians actually accept all of them, with one relatively minor clause, but even that is up for debate. The Austrians don't care. On the 28th of July, they declare war, and on the following day, they bombard Belgrade. They are determined to go to war with Serbia, whatever happens. What happens after Russia mobilises on the 30th of July? Now, there's been a lot of attention given recently, I think, completely bark up the wrong tree, trying to blame Russia, in effect, for the outbreak of the First World War. The mobilisation of the 30th of July is the Russians sending the strongest possible signal, short of war, that they are not prepared to tolerate an attack on their client state, Serbia. The problem is, and I think it's completely understandable from the Russian point of view, is that this gave the Germans an absolute gift, because they could then sell the war to their, in some cases, very sceptical people as a defensive war against Russian aggression. Don't forget, Germany in 1914 has the largest socialist movement in Europe, and many of the socialists up to this point are very dubious indeed about going to war for Austria-Hungary. Thereafter, war rapidly escalates. The Russians declare war on, Germans declare war on Russia on the 1st of August, France on the 3rd of August, and it's a German demand that Belgium be allowed German troops to cross their territory, which brings Britain into the war on the 4th of August. A couple more points I want to make before I move on to look at the role of Britain. The single most dominant figure in the debate on the origins of the First World War from the early 1960s, arguably still is today, is the German historian Fritz Fischer. In 1961, he published a book which the English title was the rather sort of anodyne Germany's Aims in the First World War. The German title translates to something like Germany's grab for world power. What Fischer argued was that, contrary to consensus in the early 1960s, Germany had deliberately planned and then waged a war of aggression. That, in effect, Germany behaved in 1914 much as Hitler was to behave in 1939 to 41. Well, given the fact that in 1961, just 16 years after the end of the Second World War, Germany was desperately trying to re-establish its position as part of the community of nations, this was, to put it mildly, very unwelcome news from Fischer. Basically, he said, my fellow Germans, we not only started the Second World War, we started the First World War as well. And this actually was seen as very red rag to a bull, particularly by older, more conservative Germans. Key to his argument is a so-called War Council that was held on the 8th of December 1912, at which Fischer argued, the decision was taken that war would be launched about 18 months hence. Suspiciously, that takes us to late June, July 1914. The argument is that, worried by the rise of the socialists, Social Democrats, which had done very well in the Reichstag elections of 1912, the imperial government took the time-honoured path to war against a foreign enemy to unite the population behind the government. Now, Fischer's views, despite causing huge controversy, particularly in his home country, within about 10-15 years had basically become the standard view. Actually, even today, I would argue that the majority of historians have a sort of modified Fischer version of the outbreak of the First World War, rather than the Sleepwalkers version. Fischer's arguments are no longer command support in their entirety, but he got some things very right. I think, at the very least, the idea that Germany was a state, or these leaders of Germany were prepared to contemplate aggressive war, I think is very important indeed. And a magisterial biography of Kaiser Wilhelm has just been finished by the Anglo-German historian John Rawle, a disciple of Fischer's, who makes a very strong and powerful case that Fischer basically is right about Germany's drive for war in 1914. And certainly the idea that assigning equal responsibility for the outbreak of the war to Germany and Austria-Hungary on one hand and Britain, Russia and France on the other simply does not stack up in my view. Finally, Britain and the Empire. It is entirely possible that Britain would not have entered the First World War, in my view, if Germany had not gone through Belgium, violated Belgian neutrality in 1914. Actually, I think that if Britain had stayed out of the war, if the Germans had played their cards more carefully, it would have been disastrous for the future of Europe, because I think almost certainly Germany would have won, with cataclysmic consequences for continental Europe, for Britain and the Empire. The British historian Neil Ferguson argued very controversially in the late 90s and has revived the idea this year. Actually, the biggest mistake in recent history was Britain's entry of the First World War. It would have been better for the benign German imperial government to have won and created what he described as the Kaiser's European Union, sort of 80 years before the event. Well, I know Neil relatively well. I've debated with him, and I must say, I don't agree with that view at all. It's a very, very rosy view of imperial Germany. Actually, if you look at the way that Germany behaved in the occupied territories in 1914, no need for counterfactual history here, look actually what they actually did. It was not as bad as the Nazis. They were not consciously genocidal, not in Europe anyway, they were in Africa, but it was bad enough. It was an extremely harsh time for the French and Belgian people who were involved in German occupation. And we often forget that when the Allied forces, British, Canadian, Australian,